Here's the headline from the recent Munich Security Conference, this gathering of global leaders in Munich. United front in Congress on Ukraine, at least in Munich. And another headline from Politico, it's the end of the world as we know it, and Munich feels nervous. And Politico reports this: the only people smiling at this year's security conference are the defense contractors. Arms sales are booming by all accounts. And one reason why they may be smiling is because lawmakers like Lindsey Graham are pushing now for more weapons to Ukraine, including F-16s. Here he is.
So here's what I believe. Once you call Russia being engaged in crimes against humanity, you have to have actions consistent with that statement. So I'm looking for this administration to follow up on that statement by designating Russia as state sponsor of terrorism under U.S. law. 100 senators urged the administration to do that. I'm also urging the administration to start F-16 training now for Ukrainian pilots. Don't worry about provoking Putin. Let's make sure we beat Putin in Ukraine, because he will not stop if we do not.
Our guest is Doug Macgregor, retired Army colonel and former senior Pentagon advisor. Colonel Macgregor, what do you make of Lindsey Graham saying he's not worried about provoking Putin and calling for F-16s being delivered to Ukraine?
Well, Senator Graham's courageous words are certainly inspiring. I always remember that he's a combat lawyer. He always points out that he's a veteran, and he was in Afghanistan, and he was in Iraq, supposedly doing whatever lawyers do in the battle zone, which usually involves telling people not to do anything. I don't know. It's incomprehensible to me that the man would make such irresponsible statements. As far as crimes against humanity are concerned, this war that we are waging at the expense of the Ukrainian people is a crime against humanity. We are instrumental in the destruction of the Ukrainian nation. Whatever happens at the end of this process is ultimately our fault, because we should have worked tirelessly at the very beginning to bring this to an end. Now, heaping insults or pouring buckets of filth and abuse all over Mr. Putin, all over the Russian state and the Russian people may be gratifying to Mr. Lindsey Graham in Washington, D.C., but it doesn't help our case. It doesn't promote peace. And it almost ensures that before everything ends, we'll have Russian troops on the Polish border, the Romanian border, the Moldovan border, and there will be no more independent Ukraine whatsoever.
We saw this episode where there was a lot of hype about the U.S. agreeing to send the M1 Abrams tank over to Ukraine. But then we got the small print, which is that, oh, the U.S. is going to delay these shipments because they're building brand new tanks for this job. So this will take a year, maybe even 2 years before these tanks even get there. If the U.S. or its allies commit to sending F-16s, well, first of all, is that a possibility to you that F-16s are committed? And if so, would that change anything on the battlefield?
Well, first of all, as you point out, most of this equipment, if it ever arrives, will arrive long past the point where it would have made any difference. And quite frankly, at this point, given the horrendous casualties, the only way that you could make any of this work is by turning vast numbers of American soldiers, Polish soldiers, German soldiers, French soldiers into mercenaries and saying that they're actually on contract. There are already 20,000 Poles fighting under Ukrainian command in Ukrainian uniform in Ukraine. There are 2,500 dead Poles lying in cemeteries in Poland, and they weren't killed in Poland, they were killed in Ukraine.
States, if you could provoke them anymore.
I don't know, you know.
And the argument that we heard there from Lindsey Graham that if we don't stop Putin in Ukraine, that he'll go on to Europe. How do you respond to that?
Oh, it's absurd. It's unworthy of any serious response. Come on. When we started this thing, started watching the Russians go in, the Russians went in with a very small force. Their aim was to convince us that they were serious about their national security. They weren't going to tolerate any more violence against Russian citizens inside Ukraine. And everyone said, oh, well, the Russians, look at this. They can't be serious. Their force is too small. Their military is incapable. Well, you've got to have it one way or the other. If they were interested in conquering Europe, then their military was always too small. Now, all of a sudden, the military has become larger and far more lethal and capable, and he still has no interest in going into Europe. He just wants to do business with Europe. We're the ones that keep spinning out that fantasy. The lies are just incomprehensible. They one lie after the other. This makes Vietnam and anything that happened in Afghanistan and Iraq look infantile.
Let's go to another advocate for sending more U.S. weapons to Ukraine, more than we're already sending. His name is John Hurst. He's the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine, speaking on the BBC.
But do you think there is a concept for the termination of war as well?
There is a concept, and that is the following. Give Ukraine right now the F-16s, the long-range missiles like ATACMS, and more tanks now, not at the end of this year, not next year. They will be able to conduct a successful offensive to cut the land bridge from Russia through Donbass to Crimea. And that will produce a major political, not just a military defeat for Russia, a huge problem as all Russian forces have to retreat into an isolated Crimea, and a major political problem for Putin at home.
Well, the reality as well is that the Russians are throwing everything at this spring offensive as well.
Yes, and they're not doing very well with that everything. They've lost tens of thousands of troops in a couple of months, and they've gained inches in Donbass. They just had a huge failure around the town of Vuhledar, where they lost a couple of their crack regiments, as well as 30 or 40 armored vehicles. So they're making very tiny gains at an extraordinary cost.
Are you concerned?
Doug Macgregor, that's the former U.S. ambassador to Ukraine. He says that Russia has suffered a number of losses and that if we just send more weapons, Ukraine can launch an offensive, cut Russia's land bridge, and even force Russia to retreat into just Crimea.
Well, I know Ambassador Herbst, met him briefly. He's full of hatred for Russia and Putin. He's full of hatred for people like me. And he's full of hatred for those of us who oppose the policies of this administration inside the United States. All I can say is that he knows absolutely nothing about military affairs. He's pointing to a handful of weapon systems, insisting that they somehow or another are the key to victory. This is the sort of delusional thinking that Hitler was guilty of in the last year of the war. We'll find a silver bullet. It'll reverse everything. It's not going to reverse anything. And then finally, he's completely misrepresenting what's been happening in southern Ukraine. And that is that the Russians went over to a defensive posture and they have ground away at the Ukrainians who poured tens of thousands of soldiers into their meat grinder. The Russians have taken very light casualties compared to the Ukrainians, and the Ukrainians have lost most of their capable forces and capable manpower. So I think he's living in a fantasy world, but that's where he and Mr. Blinken and Mr. Biden and most of his friends in the White House all live comfortably. And I don't think they're going to take well to what's coming in the next few weeks, which is going to be devastating.